Guys, are you ready to listen to some stories? Well, it's story time, my story time. I look at the clock and it's perfect timing to read one chapter, and then I would go to my English class later. Well, now let's read chapter 14 of Wave Me Goodbye by Jacqueline Wilson. Like in chapter 14, it's very interesting. It's about Shirley, Kevin, and Archie, their first day at school. And let's see how it went, alright? We're all excited for how their school day are gonna went. Oh, there's my hair sticking out. Okay, so let's continue on reading this. Are you guys excited? Remember your first day at school. How was it? Is it a funny experiment or a bad experiment? My first day at school was actually pretty fun. Although I kind of eat quite slow at the lunchtime, so I get punished for it. But that's okay. Okay, let's read chapter 14, shall we? 14. The next morning, when we were all sitting at the kitchen table in our new clothes, ready to go to school, I peered at Archie's head. It had a promising dark shadow. Now, I rubbed my hand across it to see if it felt prickly. "Leave off," he said irritably, swatting my hand away. "What's up with you, Mr. Grumpy?" Chubby asked. "I don't want to go to school, do I?" Archie growled. "It's not fair. In London, I hardly ever had to go. My last auntie said I could stay home if I felt poorly, and I feel poorly now. Look." He lay in his chair and stuck his tongue out of one side of his mouth. It had a porridge all over it, and looked horribly unattractive. "Put that tongue back in once and stop play acting," said Chubby. "You're going to school and that's that." "I don't mind school," said Kevin. "Me and the other lads have a laugh. I'm looking forward to it. I'm fed up with sticking around with girls and babies." He pointed at Archie and me with a spoon and spilled porridge down at his new tie. "For pity's sake," said Chubby. "What is it with you kids? Can't you keep clean for 5 minutes? Clean and dry." She glared at Archie, who had disgraced himself again in the night. I didn't want to go to school either. I wasn't even sure where it was. Chubby has told us, but it seemed such a long walk down the hill and through the village. I hoped Mrs. Wawe would take us to her car, but she wasn't even up yet. Chubby packed us off at 8 o'clock. She took us all the way down the drive, holding Archie's hand and chivying Kevin and me along. "I'm not having you darting off into the woods and playing hooky," she said. "I don't know how to play hooky," Archie objected. "Isn't that games with sticks? That's hockey, Goofy," said Kevin, laughing at him. How's he know that? He's only little," said Chubby. "You hold your tongue, Mr. Know-all." Kevin stuck his tongue out at her. It was only the tip, hardly noticeable, but her hand whipped out and cuffed him on the back of her head. "Don't you cheek me, mister," she said. "Come on, stop messing around. Quick, march." "My shoes hurt," I said. They really did, almost as much as my red ones. These new clodhoppers were big enough, but the leather was so hard it was like wearing iron boots. It dug right through my socks. I was sure my feet was starting to blister already. I started limping, but Chubby sniffed at me so fiercely that I stopped, scared I might get a clump on the back of the head too. I caught up with Kevin and smiled at him. "Kev, do you think I could have the shoebox your shoes came in?" I asked. "And Archie's too." "What for?" he said, rubbing his head. His hair was already sticking up and he was making it worse. "I'm making doll's house stuff," I explained. Kevin rolled his eyes. "Baby," he muttered. "No, I'm not. It's not just the kids that play with dolls' houses. I said. I was bursting to tell him about Mrs. Waverly's extraordinary secret, but I didn't trust him to keep quiet about it. I have to wait till Saturday afternoon, and then I could tell Jessica, my best friend. How I wish Jessica went to our school. Then I'll be rushing on to meet her and share everything, and school wouldn't be so scary at all. If she were in my class, we'll sit together and copy of each other in the playground. We wandered around arm in arm, and we both laughed in a superior fashion and rolled our eyes if Marilyn Henderson started saying horrible things. Archie were training to be let loose. "Can't I go and see that lovely sea again? Just for a minute," he begged. "I promise I won't go in. I just want to look." "Now listen to me, sunshine. You're not going to the lake because you're going to school. In fact, you're not going to the lake full stop, because it's dangerous, and I'm not having you drown yourself again. If you go anywhere near it, I'll hunt you down with my gun and shoot you," Chubby threatened. There seemed a lack of logic there, with Archie ended up dead in both scenarios, but she was such in a mood that I didn't care pointed out. We got to the end of the driveway, and Chubby shooed us through the large wooden gate, and then bolted them. She stayed on the other side, peering at us fiercely through the heart-shaped cutouts. "There, I'm not having you sneaking back in. I know what you kids are like. Now off you go to school," she said. "What if we get lost?" I said anxiously. "For heaven's sake, it can be more simple. Go down to the street where all the shops are, and then turn right down School Lane. School Lane, see? Meadow Ridge Primary, and mind you behave yourselves," Chubby ordered us. "But how are we going to back in?" I asked. "I'll come down and bolt the gate at 4 o'clock, she said. "Go on now, scoot." So we scooted, though our footsteps got slower and slower as we neared the village. We couldn't get lost because we simply had to follow the road. Kevin put his hands in the pockets of his new trousers and whistled as if he hadn't a care in the world, but his face was white. Archie tried to copy him, but couldn't get the knack of whistling and kept dribbling around his chin instead. He gave up and suddenly grabbed my hand. "I don't want to go to no school," he said. "I know. I don't either," I said. Kevin stopped whistling. "Then we won't. We'll scupper, but bet you no one will ever notice." I bent to ease my horrible shoes, considering. "They'll have a register. They might send a policeman after us if we don't turn up," I said. "I'm not scared of no policeman," said Kevin, swaggering. "I am," said Archie. "They took away my dad. Don't let them take me away too." He was gripping my so hard so my fingers hurt. It's okay, Archie. Maybe there aren't any policemen here. Or if there are, they might have gone to join the army now that we're at war." I stuck my chin out proudly. "My dad's in the army, ready to fight for us." "My dad says joining the army is a mug's game," said Kevin. We bickered about it as we walked. There were other children on the road now. Some were running and skipping. Some were scuffling along, heads down. Even if we'd been wearing in the school uniform, it would be been so easy to tell who was a village child and who came from London. The village kids were suntan with rosy cheeks, and their clothes were ever so old-fashioned. Some of the girls were even wearing pinafores, and they were nearly all wore boots, ugly, sturdy brown boots. My clodhoppers looked almost dainty by comparison. Kevin was eyeing up the boys. He was the tallest, but the Meadow Ridge boys had bored faces and thick necks and big shoulders. They seemed very tough. They were staring back at Kevin. They didn't look friendly. "They've just got short trousers. You've got long ones," I said quickly. "Let's do a runner," he muttered. "Let's go up the other hill. We would go and spy on your stuck-up friend and all her purple mates." It was a clever suggestion. I'd probably have said yes, and Archie would have followed us happily enough. But suddenly, that bossy boots Mrs. Hendershaw said started out of nowhere. She was holding a clipboard and register. Just as I predicted. "Hello, you three. You're Mrs. Waffly little tribe, aren't you? How are you getting on?" We shrugged our shoulders. "It's all right, thank you," I said. "I see Mrs. Waffly been kind enough to kit you out with smart new clothes," said Mrs. Henshaw. "I like that Chubby best. She's got a gun," said Chubby. "A gun?" said Mrs. Henshaw, looking startled. "And I went for a swim in the sea. Did you, dear?" Mrs. Henshaw obviously thought that Archie was making it all up. She gave Archie and me a ticket on her register. She paused when she came to Kevin. Now, I know you're only with Mrs. Wawe on a temporary basis, Keith. No, sorry, Kevin. And I think I found the perfect billet for you. They're opening up a big sport training camp over in Hailsham. They're a bit short of equipment and you might have to share a bed, but that'll doubtless end to the fun. It'll be camping with the scouts. Kevin swayed his feet. I'm not a scout, miss, he said hoarsely. I'll sooner stay where I am, with her and him. He nodded, his head at Archie and me. Yes, but there are 3 of you, and Mrs. Waverly and Miss Chubb made it plain that they couldn't cope. She changed her mind now, I said. Honestly. Oh, well, that will save a bit of admins, said Mrs. Henshaw, as she gave Kevin a ticket on her register, too. Right. Off you go now. In a school. Enjoy your first day. I was a little thirsty, so I might just grab my water bottle and drink some. I've been reading for 10 minutes non-stop. Better. Meadow Ridge Primary was nothing like Paradise Road. That had been a large, bleak, modern building with high railings all around and a bare yard. It had looked like a prison. This school was like a sprawling house, very tumble down with broken tiles on the roof and weeds sprouting out of the chimneys. The playground was mostly uneven, mossy paving stones. Archie tripped immediately and had to be held upright, and his knees mopped, while he cried noisily, his mouth square, like this. Little funny. Don't cry, Archie, all the other kids are staring at you. I hissed. You've only got a little scratch. My knees are much worse from when I fell over on Friday. This was true. They had started to bleed again, but this might have been because I couldn't stop picking the scabs in the night. At least my hideous tunic was long enough to hide them. There were 2 grown-ups standing at the main door. One was a very round lady, with a bun scrubbed up on top of her head. She looked like a wooden Noah's Ark toy. The other was Mr. Bentley. I didn't like him at all, but it was somehow a relief to see a familiar face. Ah, you're 3 waifs and you stray who took so long to find a billet, he said, as if it had been our fault. This is Miss Appleby, the head mistress of Meadow Ridge. She is generous, sharing her school facilities with us refugees from Paradise Road. You 2 older ones go to the class on the right. The little boy will be in our infants class on the left. Wipe your nose, child. Archie wiped it with the back of his hand. I'm not going in no infants. I'm going with them, he said, nudging up to Kevin and me. It's lovely in the infants, dear. We've got big packets of wax, crayons, and plastics in, said Miss Appleby. Come along, I'll show you. She dragged him away. I stared after them longingly. I've long spending a day drawing pictures and making plastics and jewelry. I'll have much sooner been an infant. The juniors was horrible. It was a terrible squash for a start. The Meadow Ridge children had begged all the wooden desk. All the Paradise Road peoples had to sit cross-legged on the floor at the front. I couldn't find a place to sit next to any of the nicer girls. I didn't want to be anywhere near Marilyn Henderson. She had noticed my terrible tunic and was whispering to Mary. They were both sniggering. In the end, I sat down beside Kevin. Our own teacher, Mrs. Grimes, hadn't been evacuated with us, so we had to share the Meadow Ridge one. I hoped for a kind, rough lady like Miss Appleby, but we had an ancient, stupid little man with thick glasses called Mr. Mitford. He looked very weak and weedy, but he soon made bossy Mr. Bentley seem like Santa Claus. He handed out pencil and thin exercise books with rough paper and told us to write a composition. What I did in the summer holidays. I want you to write at least 2 sides in your best handwriting, and I don't want to see a single spelling mistakes, he said. Are you listening, Arthur and George? There were 2 big Meadow Ridge boys at the back who were drooling with their pencil. We're all ears, sir, said one. It was an especially cheeky remark, but Mr. Mitford quivered in our range. I will not have you using that insolent tone to me, Arthur Briggs. Come up to the front of the class, he said. I thought he was just going to telling off, but Mr. Mitford went over to a cupboard and brought out a leather strap with a sinister fringe at the end. All the Paradise Road children gasped. The Meadow Ridge people sat as still as Gag's work. I'm using you as an example, Arthur Briggs. This is what happens when people misbehave in my class, said Mr. Mitford. Hold your hands. I thought he must be bluffing, simply wanting to give this author a fright. But then he raised his arm and the strap snapped in the air, and the leather fringes struck Arthur's hand so hard he was nearly knocked off his feet. He went scarlet, and tears streamed down his cheeks, though he struggled not to make a sound. I thought I might be taken to my lap there and then. I could feel Kevin shivering beside me. Return to your seat, Arthur, Mr. Mitford said calmly. He stood in front of us, holding the hateful strap in both hands. Now, does any other member of this class feel like being insolent? Silence! I'm pleased about that. It should save me a lot of effort. Still, I won't put my strap away just yet. I'll keep it here on my desk as a little reminder to you. We didn't need reminding. The snap of the strap echoed our ears. Now get on with your composition, Mr. Mitford commanded. He sat down at his desk, took a newspaper out of his briefcase, and started reading. I could see the headline in his big, bold print. Britain at war with Germany. It was clear that Mr. Mitford was at war with the entire class. My hand trembled as I started writing my composition. It was very uncomfortable without a desk. I tried balancing my exercise book on my knees, but it made my writing go wobbly, and I was certain Mr. Mitford would be a stickler for even lettering and straight lines. I had to put the books on the floor and then hunch over. Kevin was hunched too, grasping his pencil with one hand and biting the fingernails of the other. Take that finger out of your mouth, boy, Mr. Mitford shouted suddenly. Though he didn't seem to have raised his eye from his newspaper, Kevin jumped and his hand shot down to his lap. I held my breath. Surely Mr. Mitford couldn't strap him, not just for nibbling a nail, but thank goodness. He simply shook his head sternly and turned the page of his paper. I started writing again. I had lots of things to talk about. Dad had left to join the army. The house had seemed so strange without him. Mom went out a lot. I realized that she had probably been looking for work. I did some of the shopping. Mr. Kate, the grocer, said I was a handy little housewife because I could add up the cost of half a pound of streaky bacon and 4 ounces of marriage and a packet of custard creams in my head and give him the right money. I sometimes walk all the way to the park, though there weren't any swings. I went to the library nearly every day. Miss Smith, the library lady, let me help her tidy the card index and rubbed out the silly scribbles in the storybooks. I read a lot. I could list all the books I've read and give each story a little review. I wrote and wrote. My hands started to ache. Kevin was sitting still, looking agonized. His page was still blank. Write something, I whispered. I don't know what to put, he muttered. I didn't do nothing in the holidays. I just mucked about. Well, make something up then, I suggested. Kevin nibbled at his lips instead of his nails, but eventually started writing. Then he stopped. Have you got a rubber? He mouthed. I shook my head. His face screwed up. Then he licked his finger and tried to rub out his sentence like that. It just made a huge scrubby smear on the page. Kevin looked horrified. You strapped me, he whispered. I ducked down low behind the girl in front and seized his exercise book. Very slowly and carefully, I tore up the smeared front page, and the page at the back too. I was an expert at doing this. I was forever starting to write stories in notebooks from Woolworth and then wanted to change the beginning. I handed the goodest new blank exercise book back to Kevin, and he looked at me so gratefully. It made me feel funny inside. Perhaps he wasn't so bad after all. I didn't know what to do with the two outtorn pages. In the end, I folded them up very small and stuck them in my tunic pocket. Kevin tried again. We were all trying, breathing heavily. Suddenly a girl put up her hand. A girl with long fair hair ringlets, wearing a fluffy bolero. Marilyn Henderson. One of the Meadow Ridgers shook her head and gestured, but Marilyn persisted, waving her arm until she caught Mr. Mitford's eye. He glared at her. "Get on with your work, child," he snapped. "I'm sorry, Mr. Mitford, sir, but I can't," she said. Every child in the room stared at her. Mr. Mitford stared too, shaking his head as if he wasn't sure he heard her. "I've seen the film of Oliver Twist. Please, sir, can I have some more?" Mr. Mitford folded his newspaper and leaned across his desk, linking his fingers. They brushed the end of the strap called there. "You can't get on your work?" he asked. His voice was very quiet, but ominous. I prayed that he wouldn't strap her. I detested Marilyn, but I couldn't bear the thought of being hurt like that. "I'm afraid I've broken my pencil, but I don't have a sharpener with me," said Marilyn, seeming not the slightest bit scared. I couldn't help admiring her. She was smiling pleasantly at Mr. Mitford, as if he were an old friend. He blinked at her, then he picked out a pencil from the jar on his desk and beckoned to her. Marilyn stood up, head on one side, hair streaming past her shoulders, as fluffy, as adorable as her bolero. "Don't press so hard this time," said Mr. Mitford, almost jovially. "I'll take extra care," said Marilyn, taking the pencil and skipping back to her space. Kevin and I rolled around at each other. It was so unfair. Marilyn could get away with murder. Mr. Chamberlain should send her away to Germany. All she had to do was toss her ringlets and say, "I'm sorry, Mr. Hitler, sir, but could you please stop this silly war? And then we'll be able to go home." Perhaps Mr. Mitford wasn't so fierce with girls, I thought, but when Mary put up her hand and said she'd broken her pencil too, he was furious. He didn't strap her, but he shouted at her, calling her a copycat. "I'm not wasting another pencil on you. Now get on with your work," he bellowed. "But I can't. My pencil's broken," Mary gabbled, nearly in tears. "You should have been more careful. Now hold your tongues." So Mary simply had to sit there, unable to finish her composition. She still didn't have a pencil for arithmetic and couldn't copy out any of the sum. I couldn't believe Mr. Mitford could be so unfair. I wish I was brave enough to stand up and confront him, but knew this would be suicide. At break time, there was a great hubbub in the grassy playground. All the Paradise Road children huddled together, calling Mr. Mitford all the names under the sun, all except Marilyn Henderson. "He was very strict, I suppose, but he has to be, with all them big, tough country boys," she said. "He's okay as long as you keep on the right side with him. And don't look frightened." Mary was such a fool that she actually nodded in agreement. One of the boys took pity on her and chewed on the end of her broken pencil until the lead was exposed again. Archie came skipping to us, beaming brightly, talking 19 to the dozen about sailing a toy boat in a water trough. His new shirt was soaking, but he didn't care. He said he loved Miss Appleby. "Trust us to get a total mutter for our teacher," said Kevin. "I just know I'll get up getting strapped." "No, you won't, not if you don't cheek him," I said. "I'll break my own blooming pencil or knock something over or spill something. You know what I'm like," said Kevin, and I just wrote a whole load of rubbish for my composition thingy. "You're all right. You wrote pages. You're really a clever clog, Shirley." "No, I'm not," I said modestly, though I hoped he was right. After break, we had a PT lesson. It was terribly embarrassing because us girls had to take off our frocks and skirts and tunics, and the boys had to remove their shirts and shorts. So there we were, on our vests and pants. I had to show my pink frills to an entire class of sniggering children. Even Mr. Mitford raised his eyebrows. I wanted to die. I was in trouble at dinner time, too. We were each served a plate of brown stew. I asked Kevin if he thought it was rabbit. He said it wasn't, but I couldn't be sure. I asked all the children on my table and they shrugged. One said it was mutton. Another said it was beef, but a third said it could be rabbit. I decided not to risk it. I nibbled at my potatoes and carrots, but didn't touch the brown meat, not even the gravy. "You'll get into trouble," said one of the village children. "Mr. Mitford always inspects our plates when he's on dinner duty. You have to eat everything, even the fat and gristle." I had a vision of Mr. Mitford prizing open my mouth so he could shovel the brown stew down my gullet. I wrenched in anticipation. "I'll eat it for you," Kevin said quickly, and swapped plates with me. He wolfed my stew down in seconds. "Oh, thank you so much, Kev," I said. "It's nothing. I was still hungry. Anyways, us two are pals, right? You help me out, I help you out," he said. He couldn't help me out in the girls' toilet. They were unbelievably horrible. It wasn't simply that they smelled dreadful. There were no doors, just 2 rows of white wooden benches with bottom-side holes cut in the top. I've never even imagined such a terrible and embarrassing thing. The middle-aged girl didn't seem to mind. They settled in, threw a sheet or two of lavatory paper, and then hinged themselves over a hall, idly chatting. I stared, horrified, deciding I could never, ever do that. I would simply have to hang on until I got back to the red house. My bladder was aching. What if I couldn't hang on? What if I wet myself in class? What could Mr. Mitford said? I waited until I heard the bell ring for afternoon school. The other girls ran off. I jumped onto a hole and used it as quickly as I could, and then toured off to the classroom, making it back a split second before Mr. Mitford himself. We had an art lesson next, but there weren't enough sugar paper to go around, so half of us had to make do with line sheet. There were no powder paints, just a few wax crayons. The metal red children grabbed them quickly, so the Paradise Road people had to make do with their lead pencil. "The subject is the countryside," said Mr. Mitford. Kevin and I exchanged with a pencil, a scrappy sheet of paper, and nowhere to rest or a page. "Does he mean to draw all them hills and trees and cows and everything?" Kevin whispered. "Search me. I think we better draw just one thing," I said. I drew a kingfisher lying to a tree, with no blue or orange crayon, and it looked like any old bird, but I couldn't help it. I drew me looking it up, pointing, a smile on my face. "That's good," said Kevin. I peered at his page. He'd drawn Chubby, a stick lady with a shotgun. He printed, "Bang, bang," coming off the gun. Chubby was standing on a line to indicate the ground. At the other end of the line lay a rabbit. Identifiable because it had long, floppy ears. It was on its back with its paws in the air. It had a little arrow pointing to its head with a stark message, "Dead." "What do you think of mine, then?" Kevin asked. "Do you get it? That's Chubby and—" "Yes, I get it. But maybe you shouldn't have made it like a comic. He said do a picture," I said, worried. "It is a picture," said Kevin. I hope Mr. Mitford would think it was, though I doubted it. He chose merely to be a class monitor and asked her to collect up all the pictures. He didn't even glance at them when she put them on his desk in the tidy pile. Then we had the last lesson. School seemed to have been going on for 6 days already, so it was a slight comfort to think that there were only 40 minutes of torture to go. It was a lesson called vocabulary. I looked around at the village children at their desk. They were all pulling faces. They don't look as if they liked vocabulary one little bit. Mr. Mitford stood at the backboard and wrote a sentence in a clear, looping hand. The chalk tapped again and again on the board. His sentences were surprisingly autobiographical. Mr. Mitford went to immense pains to the new children in his classroom, but there weren't enough chairs to go around. When he finished, he made us read aloud in unison. Some of the children from both schools read very slowly, stumbling and spelling words out under their breath. He made us read it again with more expression, giving a little nod when he came to the missing word. "Now, children, who can fill the missing word for me?" he asked. There was a long silence. I thought I knew the answer, but I didn't dare put up my hand. He might strap me if I got it wrong. He started picking on children one by one. "You, Peter Howard." "Don't know, sir." "Well, like a gas boy. Is it ask?" "Ask? How could ask make sense, you stupid boy? It's not a proper sentence, and it's ridiculous anyway. Stand up with your hands on your head, you little dings." He selected another child. "You, Beth Morgan, what is the missing word? Come along, I'll give you a new clue. It begins with A. Think. A's for apple," she blurted, flying back to infant school. Several children tittered nervously. Both Beth stood up too. Her hand clapped over her parting. Another deuce. Mr. Mitford looked around at the Paradise Road children, sitting cross-legged at the front. We all hunched down, but poor Kevin couldn't help being the most conscientious. "Yeah, boy, the great gawky one. What's your name?" "Kevin Moffat." "Kevin Moffat, sir." "Now can you fill the missing word for me, Kevin Moffat?" I tried mouthing it to him, but he wasn't looking at me. He was staring helplessly at Mr. Mitford. "No, sir," he mumbled. "Well, stand up, you great lummox." "My goodness, exactly. How tall are you?" "Don't know, sir," said Kevin. "Too tall is the correct answer. Now go next to the giant ignorus." There's still a lot more, but I have to stop now. It's over 30 minutes and my mouth are parched. Bye.